The apartment on the third floor of the grand old building on the Ringstrasse was a temple to sound. But for most of the day, it was a temple of silence, a heavy, expectant quiet that seemed to soak into the velvet curtains and the polished oak floors. This silence was the domain of the Maestro. He was a man shaped by music, or perhaps he had shaped himself to fit its most demanding contours. Now, in his later years, his hair a distinguished silver wave, his posture was still that of a man about to address the keys. His name, Victor Reinhardt, carried weight in concert halls from Vienna to New York. Here, in his home, it was law that the day moved to a strict, unspoken schedule. At 10, the silence was broken by scales, precise and punishing, as he practiced. At 11, the first student arrived, always nervous, often wealthy, clutching sheet music like a life preserver. The Maestro's hearing was legendary. He could detect a hint of hesitation in a trill from 3 rooms away. Through this orchestrated world moved Elena. She was a quiet woman in her late 40s, with careful hands and eyes that missed little. She was the keeper of the temple, not the priest. She dusted the countless books on music theory, wiped the framed portraits of composers who glowered down from the walls, and most carefully of all, polished the grand piano. It was a magnificent instrument, its black lacquer a deep, silent pool in the center of the room. Elena treated it with a reverence that bordered on fear. She used a specific soft cloth, moving it in gentle circles, never disturbing the sheet music left open on the stand, like a sacred text. She knew the piano was not furniture. It was the heart of the place, and the Maestro was its voice. Elena had a daughter, Anya. The Maestro knew this in the vague way he knew the name of his postman. She was a fact, a part of Elena's outside life that sometimes drifted into the edges of his own. A girl of 16, with a quietness that mirrored her mother's. Sometimes, if her school finished early, she would wait in the small, bright kitchen, doing her homework at the table until Elena was done. The Maestro would pass her with a brief, distant nod. She was part of the background. One crisp autumn afternoon, the scheduled order of things cracked. The Maestro had been teaching a pupil, a young man with perfectly manicured hands and a rich father. The lesson had not gone well. The boy was playing a Chopin nocturne, but under his fingers it was just notes pretty, but empty. It was like watching someone recite a beautiful poem in a language they didn't understand. "Stop," the Maestro said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't shout. His disappointment was quieter and far more crushing. "You are playing the what, but not the why. Where is the longing? It is not a lullaby. It is a sigh into the night." The boy flushed, his fingers stiffening on the keys. He started again, but now it was worse forced and anxious. The Maestro closed his eyes, not in concentration, but in a kind of pained resignation. This was the curse of teaching the privileged. They had the best instruments, the expensive tutors, but so often, the music was just another thing they felt they should own, not a language they needed to speak. When the boy finally stumbled to an end, the Maestro dismissed him with a weary wave. "Practice the silence between the notes," he said, a piece of advice he knew would be misunderstood. The boy gathered his things, relief visible on his face as he escaped into the hallway. The Maestro was left alone in the sudden quiet, the failed lesson hanging in the air like dust. He poured himself a small glass of water, his back to the room. This was when he heard the soft, almost imperceptible sound of movement. He turned. It was the girl, Anya. She must have come in while he was battling with the nocturne. She was at the piano, not sitting, but standing beside it. In her hand was the familiar soft cloth. She was polishing the lid, her movements slow and rhythmic. But it was her other hand that caught his attention. As her right hand made circles with the cloth, the fingers of her left hand rested lightly on the gleaming wood. And they were moving, not tapping. not fidgeting. They were tracing very slowly the sweeping line of the piano's curve, and as they did, they subtly flexed and curled, independent of each other, as if they were feeling for keys, as if they were practicing a phantom scale. A strange irritation bubbled up in the maestro. The quiet after a bad lesson was sacred. This intrusion, this silent pantomime at the altar of his instrument, felt like a trespass. The girl, sensing his gaze, froze. Her hand stopped moving and went still on the wood. The irritation needed an outlet. The boy's failure, the girl's presence, it all mixed together. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was a frustrated artist, and his words could be sharp. "Do not smear the polish," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. Anya's head dipped, her shoulders tightening. But then she looked up, not at his face, but at the sheet music still open on the stand, the tragic sighing Chopin. Her eyes scanned the lines of notes for just a second too long. There was no fear in that look. It was something else. A recognition that the maestro saw it. That was the spark that lit the tinder. This girl, the housekeeper's daughter, looking at Chopin as if she could read it? It was absurd. It was presumptuous. His mouth tightened into a thin line. "It seems the instrument fascinates you," he said, the words dripping with a cool, mocking politeness. He took a step closer. "Or perhaps you believe you could do better than my pupil? That you could find this feeling he so lacks?" Anya said nothing. She just slowly pulled her cloth back, clutching it in a ball in her hand. But she didn't look away. That was the most surprising thing. She held his gaze, and in her dark eyes, he didn't see the cowed shame he expected. He saw a quiet, steady pool of what? Not defiance, exactly. More a patient kind of waiting. As if he were the one performing, and she was simply listening, judging the quality of his silence. It unnerved him. This was not the natural order. He was Victor Reinhardt. People, especially children in his parlor, did not look at him like that. He glanced at the kitchen door, where he knew Elena was likely listening, frozen in fear. He looked back at the girl, at her silent, knowing face. The challenge had been issued, not in words, but in that look. And the maestro, in his world of grand performances and ego, never could resist a challenge, especially one he was so certain of winning. He didn't say anything more. He just gave a short, dismissive hum, turned on his heel, and walked to his study, closing the door with a soft, final click. The parlor was left to Anya and the silent, watchful piano. Outside, a tram clattered by on the Ringstrasse. In the kitchen, Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. And in the temple of silence, a new kind of tension had been strung, tight as a piano wire, waiting for the first note to be struck. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the parlor, painting long, lazy rectangles across the floor. The maestro's bad mood had not lifted. It sat on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He was in his study, trying to read a new biography of a composer he admired, but the words kept swimming into a blur. All he could hear was the ghost of that clumsy nocturne, and see the girl's unsettlingly steady eyes. A knock on the apartment door broke his concentration. Elena's soft footsteps moved to answer it. Voices filtered down the hall, a familiar, booming one, and Elena's polite, muted replies. The maestro straightened up. It was his old friend, a concert promoter from Prague. A bear of a man with a thick beard and a sharp eye for talent, or more accurately, for what would sell tickets. He was a connection to the outside world of concerts and tours. A world the maestro, in his retirement from the stage, still liked to feel connected to. The maestro smoothed his hair and walked out to greet him. "My friend, you are early. Good, good. Come, sit." The promoter clapped him on the back. "Victor, always a pleasure." Your home smells of discipline and old paper. I like it. They settled in the parlor. The promoter took his usual armchair, his eyes roaming the room, taking inventory of the valuable first editions and the exquisite piano. Elena brought in a tray with a polished silver pot of coffee, small cups, and a plate of delicate biscuits. She moved with her usual quiet efficiency, but the maestro noticed a slight tightness around her mouth. She was worried. About the girl, no doubt. The thought irritated him a new dot. As Elena poured the coffee, the promoter leaned back, sighing. So, tell me, any fresh wonders? Any young geniuses you're molding in that fearsome workshop of yours? The maestro snorted, stirring his coffee. Genius? No. Rich fathers with ambitious sons? A warehouse full. They have the fingers, sometimes. But the heart? He tapped his own chest. Empty. They play to impress, not to express. It is a parlor trick. The promoter laughed. You are too hard on them, Victor. Not everyone can be you. It is not about being me, the maestro said, his voice rising slightly. It is about serving the music. The music demands everything. It is not a hobby for a Wednesday afternoon. His gaze drifted past his friend, through the open door to the kitchen. He could just see the edge of the girl's school bag by the table leg. She was in there, waiting, listening. The conversation turned to gossip about the music world, but the maestro's attention was split. The memory of the girl's fingers, tracing that phantom melody on the piano lid, kept intruding. That look she gave him. It wasn't respectful fear. It was more like pity, as if she felt sorry for him and his frustrated pupil. The arrogance of it. The promoter was telling a story about a 10-year-old who could play a complicated piece at double speed. A circus act, the maestro muttered. Nothing more. But the crowds love a circus act, the promoter chuckled. Then he nodded towards the kitchen, lowering his voice. And what about your quiet shadow in there? The daughter. Does she play? It must be in the air, living here. Elena, who was just entering to refill the coffee pot, went very still. Her eyes flew to the maestro's face, wide with a silent plea. The question, and Elena's fear, was the final nudge. That simmering irritation, the bruised ego from the earlier failure, the strange challenge in the girl's eyes, it all boiled over into a single, clear, cruel idea. It would be a lesson for the girl about her place, a demonstration for his friend about true, impossible talent versus childish dabbling, and a private, bitter joke for himself. He held Elena's gaze for a moment, seeing the panic there, and then looked back at his friend with a thin, theatrical smile. Play? Well, we shall see, shall we? He raised his voice, clear and commanding. Girl, come in here. A moment of dead silence. Then, Anya appeared in the doorway. She had changed out of her school clothes into a simple, worn dress. She looked from her mother's pale face to the maestro, then to the large, curious stranger. Come, don't hover, the maestro said, waving her into the center of the room. She took a few steps, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. My friend here wonders if the music in this apartment has rubbed off on you. And after today, I find myself curious too. He stood up, his movements grand, like he was on a stage. He walked to the piano, to the heavy, leather-bound book of sheet music that sat on a stand beside it. This was his personal collection, the hard stuff. He flipped through it with purpose, the pages making a soft, threatening whisper. He stopped, and with a flourish, he pulled out a single sheet and placed it on the piano's music stand. The paper was old, the notes a dense black swarm across the staves. At the top, in ornate script, were the words La Campanella. The promoter let out a low whistle. Ah, the little bell. You're not serious, Victor. The maestro ignored him. He looked at Anya. "This," he said, tapping the paper, "is by list. It is a study. A test. It is about speed and lightness and precision. It is considered quite difficult." He allowed a small, humorless smile. "My students work for years before they even dare to look at it. Most never play it well." He could see Elena trembling by the sideboard. The promoter was watching, intrigued, leaning forward in his chair. "You looked at the Chopin earlier as if you understood it," the maestro continued, his tone deceptively gentle. "So let us have a little experiment. Let us see what your understanding is. Sit." The word hung in the air. Anya looked at the piano. It seemed larger than ever, a monstrous black creature. She looked at the sheet of music, a chaotic, inscrutable code. Her face was unreadable. "Victor, really, she's just a child," the promoter said, but there was amusement in his voice. He was enjoying the drama. "Nonsense," the maestro said, his eyes locked on Anya. "If one is old enough to silently critique a master's pupil, one is old enough to demonstrate an alternative. Consider it a practical lesson in humility. For all of us." That did it? He saw a flicker in her eyes, not fear, but a sharp understanding. He had seen her quiet judgment, and this was his answer. A public, impossible task designed for her to fail. Slowly, Anya walked to the piano. She didn't look at her mother. She looked at the keys, then at the terrifying sheet of music. The room was so quiet, they could hear the ticking of the grand clock in the hall. She reached out and carefully, as if it might bite, adjusted the piano bench. She sat down. Her back was straight, but not stiff. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, just looking at the music. The maestro folded his arms, waiting for the first fumbled note, the embarrassed shake of the head, the tears. Anya took a deep, quiet breath. She lifted her hands and placed them over the keys. Her fingers were not long and slender like a classic pianist's. They were capable-looking, strong. She flexed them once. Then she began. The first notes were not a timid search. They were not the slow, broken plinking he expected. They were a statement. Clear, bell-like, and perfectly in time. They rang out into the silent room, bright, precise, and shocking. The maestro's folded arms loosened. He blinked. Her hands, which had seemed so ordinary, came alive. They flew across the keys, not with brutal force, but with a breathtaking, dancing agility. The right hand picked out the ridiculous leaping melody, the little bells, with a clarity that was absurd. The left hand provided a foundation, not just chords, but a pulsing, rhythmic life. But it wasn't the notes. Anyone with a decade of practice could learn the notes. It was the sound she pulled from the instrument. It was light, it was playful, it had a sparkling, mischievous joy to it. She wasn't fighting the piano. She was teasing music out of it, making it sing and laugh. The promoter's coffee cup was frozen halfway to his lips. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open. Elena had both hands pressed over her mouth, as if holding in a scream or a sob. The maestro felt the floor tilt under him. His heart was a frantic drum in his chest, out of sync with the flawless, glittering rhythm filling his parlor. He stared at the girl's profile. Her face was calm, focused, but there was a faint, unmistakable glow of concentration and pleasure. She was enjoying it. This was impossible. This was a joke, a trick. She must have secretly learned it. But how? Where? On what? The piece was a monster, a rite of passage for virtuosos. And this girl, the housekeeper's daughter, was not just playing it. She was playing with it. She was making it hers. The final dizzying run cascaded down the keyboard, a shower of sonic sparks, and ended with two crisp, perfect chords that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the room. Then, silence. a silence deeper and more profound than any the maestro had ever cultivated. It was the silence after an explosion. It was the silence of a world being reordered. Anya lowered her hands to her lap. She didn't turn around. She just sat there, looking at the keys she had just commanded, breathing softly. The maestro realized he had stopped breathing altogether. The silence didn't just fill the room. It swallowed it whole. For a long moment, no one moved. The air itself felt charged, thick with the ghost of the music and the shock of everyone in it. Anya kept her hands in her lap, her head slightly bowed, as if waiting for the last echo to die completely inside the piano. The afternoon sunbeam had inched across the floor, now catching the dust motes dancing above the piano lid, stirred up by the violence of the performance. The promoter was the first to break. He didn't speak. A sound escaped him, a strangled, wordless exclamation that was part laugh, part gasp. He slammed his coffee cup down on the side table, the china clattering dangerously, and surged to his feet. What? What was that? He boomed, his voice too loud for the stunned room. He wasn't looking at the maestro. He was staring at Anya's back, as if she had just grown wings. Who taught you that? Asterisk, who are you? Asterisk, his movement broke the spell. Elena flinched, her hands falling from her mouth. Her face was a map of confusion, pride, fear, and a deep maternal worry, all fighting for control. She took a step towards her daughter, then stopped. Looking helplessly at the maestro. The maestro, however, had not moved. He stood frozen by his chair, his arms still half folded, now looking limp and foolish. The confident, mocking posture was gone. In its place was a kind of hollowed-out stillness. All the blood seemed to have drained from his face, leaving his skin pale and waxy. He was looking at Anya, but he wasn't really seeing her. He was seeing the music. He was hearing it again, replaying in his mind's ear with a terrible, brilliant clarity. He had heard La Campanella 100 times. He had played it himself in his youth, with fiery technique that had brought audiences to their feet. He had taught it to a handful of his very best, most dedicated students, watching them struggle for months to master its mechanical challenges. But he had never heard it sound like that. It wasn't just that she played the notes. Any skilled robot could be programmed to hit the right keys at the right time. She had played the intention. Liszt hadn't just written a difficult exercise. He had written a picture of shimmering bells, of playful lightness, of ethereal joy. And this girl, this quiet shadow from the kitchen, had reached into the page and pulled that exact picture into the air. Her touch had been feather-light where it needed to be, her rhythm dancing, not marching. She had made a monster sound delicate. She had made an obstacle course sound like a game, and she had done it in his parlor, on his piano. After he had set her up for a humiliating public failure, the promoter was now circling the piano like an excited bear. Answer me, child. Where did you study? At the conservatory? With whom? This is not possible. That interpretation, the touch. Victor, are you hearing this? Are you seeing this? The maestro finally blinked. The sound of his own name, in that tone of bewildered awe, was like a slap. It dragged him back into the room, into the reality of what had just happened. The reality was a towering, crushing wave of shame. It wasn't just embarrassment at being wrong. It was a profound, artistic shame. He, Victor Reinhardt, a man who prided himself on hearing the soul in music, had been utterly deaf. He had looked at this girl and seen furniture. He had listened to the silence around her and heard nothing. While he had been lecturing a rich boy about feeling, a living, breathing example of it had been polishing his piano. He found his voice, but it came out rough, stripped of its usual authority. Be quiet, he said to the promoter, but it sounded more like a plea. He took a step forward, then another, his legs feeling unsteady. He walked towards the piano, towards Anya. She finally turned on the bench to face him. There was no smirk of triumph on her face, no glare of accusation. Her expression was calm, open, and a little tired, as if she had just run a very long race. She looked at him with those same dark, knowing eyes, but now there was a question in them. Asterisk, now do you see? Asterisk, how? The word scraped out of the maestro's throat. It was the only thing he could think to ask. Anya glanced at her mother. Elena gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes glistening. I listen, Anya said quietly. Her voice was softer than her playing, but just as clear. When you teach, from the kitchen, or when I wait, you listen, the maestro repeated dumbly. Yes, and I remember. The way you explain things. Not just the notes, but the other part. The story behind them. She gestured weakly towards the sheet music. That one. It's not angry. It's happy. It's like chasing sunlight. Chasing sunlight. The maestro felt a physical ache in his chest. In one simple, childish phrase, she had nailed an interpretation it had taken him years to articulate to students. But the technique, the promoter interrupted, unable to contain himself. You cannot listen to technique. Your fingers. How? Anya looked down at her own hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. There is a community center. By the river. They have an old piano in a room. The key for the caretaker is under a flower pot. She said it simply, a statement of fact. I go after school sometimes. Before Mama finishes work. It's out of tune. And the middle C sticks. But it works. The image formed in the maestro's mind with painful clarity. A dark, musty room with a battered upright. This girl stealing hours, teaching herself the most difficult music in the world by ear and by memory on a broken instrument. While his own students complained about the touch of a Steinway versus a Bissendorfer. And the sheet music? The maestro asked, pointing to the complex notation. You can read this? Anya shook her head, a faint blush of what looked like shame coloring her cheeks. Not like you do. I see the shapes, the ups and downs. I remember the patterns from what I hear. The paper, it's like a map I already know the way through. It was a form of genius he couldn't comprehend. Perfect pitch, a photographic memory for music. An instinctive physical technique all wrapped in a quiet, unassuming girl who saw sheet music as a topographic map of a landscape. She could already hear the promoter threw his hands up. A natural. A true, raw natural. Victor, this is incredible. We must leave. The maestro's voice cut through the man's excitement. Flat and final. The promoter stared at him. What? You will leave now, the maestro said, turning to face him. His pale face was now set in stone, his eyes burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with anger. It was a desperate need for the room to be empty, for this staggering, humbling reality to contain only the three of them. We will speak of this another time. Not now. Seeing the look on his old friend's face, the promoter's commercial fervor faded. He nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning on him. This wasn't just a discovery. It was an earthquake in the maestro's private world. He collected his coat, casting one last, long look at Anya, who had turned back to the piano keys, tracing one gently with a fingertip. You have a treasure here, Victor, he said quietly at the door. Do not let it tarnish. Then he was gone. The sound of the front door closing echoed down the hall. In the renewed silence, the maestro did not look at Elena. He only had eyes for the girl. The weight of his own arrogance, his blindness, pressed down on him so heavily he thought his knees might buckle. He had wanted to teach her a lesson in humility. The lesson had been delivered, but he was the one who had learned it. He walked to the window and stared out at the street below, seeing nothing. He had built his entire life, his entire identity, on the understanding of music. He had sorted people into categories, those who had it and those who did not. He had placed himself firmly at the pinnacle of the first category, and he had, without a second thought, placed this girl and her mother in the second. And he had been wrong. Not just a little wrong. Catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. The truest music he had heard in years had come from the last place he had ever thought to look. And the silence that now followed, it was the loudest, most accusing sound of his life. The clock in the hall ticked through the heavy quiet. The maestro stayed at the window, his back to the room, to the piano, to the girl and her mother. He couldn't face them yet. Outside, the world went on as always, trams clattering, people walking, life moving in its ordinary rhythm. It felt like a personal insult. Inside the parlor, the air was different. It had been cracked open. Elena finally moved, her shoes making a soft shuffle on the floor as she went to her daughter. She didn't speak. She just placed a hand on Anya's shoulder. The girl leaned back slightly, resting her head against her mother's side. It was a small gesture, but it spoke of a deep, private understanding between them, a fortress the maestro had never noticed. He heard the rustle of fabric, the quiet sigh. He had to turn around. He was the one who had caused this. He couldn't hide by the curtains forever. When he faced them, he saw Anya sitting straight again on the bench, her hands folded. Elena stood behind her, a protective shadow. Their eyes were on him, waiting. There was no anger in their faces, no triumph, just a watchful, weary patience. That, somehow, was worse. If they had been furious, he could have gotten angry back. If they had been gloating, he could have dismissed them. But their quiet expectation forced him to actually think, and every thought was a needle of shame. He cleared his throat. The sound was horribly loud. You should go," he said to Elena. His voice was rough, unfamiliar. "For the day. Go home." Elena's expression tightened. She thought he was dismissing them, firing them. Her arm went more tightly around Anya's shoulders. "Sir, No," he interrupted, holding up a hand. He couldn't manage her misunderstanding right now. "I do not mean that. I mean you are finished for today. Paid for the week. Please, go." The words came out in a jumble. I need to be alone. To think? Elena studied his face. She had worked for him for 7 years. She had seen him in every mood, irritable, focused, melancholic, proud. She had never seen him look like this. The certainty was gone from his eyes, replaced by a kind of lost, stunned confusion. He looked old Dot slowly. She nodded. "Come," she said softly to Anya. Anya stood up from the piano bench. She gave one last, lingering look at the keys, and followed her mother to the kitchen to gather her school bag. The maestro stood rooted to the spot, listening to the muted sounds of them leaving, the click of a latch on a lunch pail, the rustle of a coat, the soft murmur of their voices too low to hear. The front door opened and closed with a soft, definitive thud. He was alone. The silence rushed back in, but it was a different silence now. Before, it had been his silence, a thing he controlled, a canvas for his music. Now it felt empty and accusing. It was filled with the phantom echo of the list, and with the memory of his own voice, so smug and condescending. Asterisk, let us have a little experiment. Asterisk, he walked slowly to the piano. He stopped in front of the very spot where Anya had stood polishing the lid, where her fingers had traced their phantom scales. He stared at the sheet music still open on the stand, the swarm of black notes for La Campanella. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the paper. It was just paper. To her, it was a map. To his best students, it was a mountain to climb. To him, it had been a weapon. A groan escaped him, a raw sound of pure self-disgust. He sank onto the piano bench, the leather cool through his trousers. He put his own hands on the keys, in the position he had taken 10,000 times. He tried to play the opening of the piece. His fingers, once celebrated for their power and precision, felt thick and clumsy. He hit a wrong note, a sour, ugly sound that made him flinch. He snatched his hands back as if the keys had burned him. He couldn't play it. Not like that. Not with that life, that joy. He rested his forehead against the smooth, cool wood of the piano's fallboard. He thought of the community center by the river. A sticky middle C. He thought of her listening from the kitchen, absorbing his lessons while she wiped counters. He had been pouring knowledge into the ears of students who bought it like fancy chocolates, while a thirsty child was drinking the spilled drops from the floor. His whole life, he had believed in a hierarchy. Talent was cultivated in certain soils, in conservatories, in the children of the cultured elite. It was nurtured with the best teachers, the finest instruments. He was a product of that system, a pillar of it. Anya had just blown that system to pieces with 10 fingers and a broken piano. What was his purpose then? To teach the teachable? He had failed to teach the boy today. To recognize genius? He had been utterly blind to it, living in his own home. To curate beauty? He had nearly crushed it under his heel for a cheap laugh. The afternoon light faded into a soft, gray twilight. He didn't turn on any lamps. He sat in the growing dark, surrounded by the ghosts of composers whose music he loved, feeling like a fraud in his own temple. He thought about the promoter's excited face. The man would be back. He would want to manage her, to put her on a stage, to sell tickets to the Maestro's prodigy Maid. The idea made him feel sick. It would be packaging her like a circus act, exactly what he had scorned. It would take that pure, instinctive love and twist it into a commodity. She would be eaten alive. But the other option, to do nothing? To let her go back to stealing hours on a broken piano? To let that sound, that miraculous, sunlight-chasing sound, wither in a dusty community hall? That was an even greater sin. It would make him not just blind, but actively destructive. A new, terrifying thought began to form. It wasn't a clean thought. It was tangled with his shame, his wounded pride, his deep artistic hunger. If that sound existed in the world, it was a gift. And if he had failed to nurture it, perhaps his duty now was not to nurture, but to get out of its way, while making sure nothing else stood in its way either. He was not the source of the water. But maybe, having dammed the stream without knowing it, he could now remove the dam. He stood up, his joints stiff. He turned on a single lamp, a pool of warm light falling on the piano. He carefully closed the sheet music for the list and put it back in the heavy binder. He walked to his desk, took out a fresh piece of his own elegant stationery, and picked up his pen. He sat for a long time, the pen hovering over the paper. How do you begin such a letter? How do you apologize for not seeing a person? How do you offer a gift that is also a penance? Finally, he began to write. The words came slowly, with many crossings out. Asterisk, Elena. Asterisk, asterisk. Please return tomorrow at your usual time. Bring your daughter. Asterisk, he stopped. That was an order, and he was done giving them orders. He crumpled the paper and started again. Asterisk, Elena. Asterisk, asterisk. What happened today has changed many things. I would like, if you are willing, to speak with you and your daughter tomorrow. There is much to discuss. Asterisk still not right. Too formal, too cold. It sounded like a business meeting. He put his head in his hands. He was a man who could speak 5 languages of music, but he couldn't find the right words in his own tongue. He took a 3rd sheet. He thought of Anya's face, that calm patience. He thought of her simple explanation. Asterisk, I listen. He wrote, his script less controlled than usual. Elena, asterisk, asterisk, I heard your daughter today. Truly heard her. For the first time. I was wrong. More wrong than I can possibly say, asterisk, asterisk. I would be honored if you both would come to see me tomorrow. Not for work. To talk. About her future, and how I might help, if you will allow it. Asterisk, asterisk, Victor Reinhardt, asterisk. He read it over. It was raw. It exposed his shame. It offered no excuses. For the first time that day, it felt like something honest. He folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and wrote Elena's name on it. He would leave it on the kitchen table for her to find in the morning. He stood and walked back to the parlor, to the piano. He didn't try to play. He just laid a hand flat on the lid, over the spot she had polished. The wood was smooth and cool. The instrument was silent, but it no longer felt like his. It felt like it was waiting for its true voice to return. And for the first time in his long, proud career, Victor Reinhardt felt he was waiting too. The morning light in the kitchen was different. It fell across the familiar table, the stove, the sink, but it felt like it was illuminating a new world. Elena found the letter propped against the sugar bowl. Her hands shook as she opened it. She read the words once, then again, her lips moving silently. Asterisk, I heard. I was wrong. Honored? These were not words from the man she knew. She folded the paper carefully, her heart a tangled knot of hope and dread. Anya was quiet over breakfast. She didn't ask about the letter. She just stirred her oatmeal, her mind clearly somewhere else, her fingers tapping a silent rhythm on the chipped tabletop. We have to go. Elena said finally, her voice firm. We have to hear what he says. Anya just nodded dot when they arrived at the apartment. The door was unlocked. The usual first sounds, the maestro's scales or the metronome's tick, were absent. The silence was waiting for them. They found him in the parlor, not at the piano, but in an armchair. He was dressed formally, as if for important meeting, but he looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept. Please, he said, gesturing to the sofa opposite him. Sit. They sat, close together. Elena perched on the edge, back straight. Anya folded her hands in her lap, her eyes taking in the room as if seeing it for the first time. The maestro did not offer tea. He did not make small talk. He looked directly at Elena. First, he began, the words coming slowly, as if each one was heavy. I owe you both an apology. Not for the music, for my blindness, for my arrogance. I treated your presence in my home as part of the scenery. I was a fool. I am sorry. Elena's breath caught. She had expected many things: dismissal, a strange new arrangement, perhaps even anger. A genuine, unvarnished apology from Victor Reinhardt was not one of them. She gave a small, tight nod, accepting it but not yet trusting it. He then turned to Anya. And you, what you did yesterday, it was not a trick. It was truth. You have a gift, a serious, demanding gift, and I almost used it for a joke. He looked down at his own hands, resting on his knees. That is a shame I will carry. Anya met his gaze. You didn't know, she said simply. It wasn't forgiveness, just a fact. I should have, he said, his voice thick. It is my job to know. I failed. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. Now we must talk about this gift. My friend, the man who was here, he will call. He will want to put you on stage, to make you famous very quickly. It would be the wrong thing. Elena leaned forward, protective. You do not think she is good enough? A pained smile touched the maestro's lips. She is too good. That is the problem. That kind of fame, that fast, it is like a fire. It burns up the fuel very quickly and leaves only ashes. It would take what is pure in her playing and turn it into a product. She is not ready for that machine. And it would take her from you. He saw the fear in Helena's eyes and knew he had hit the mark. Her greatest worry wasn't failure. It was losing her daughter to a world she couldn't understand or protect her from. So, what do you suggest? Elena asked, her voice low. A different path, he said. A harder one in some ways. A slower one. He looked at Anya. You have a magnificent engine. But even the finest car needs a road to drive on. You have the spirit of the music, but not the language. You play by memory and by heart. You need the grammar, theory, history, technique that is not just instinct, but understanding. Anya listened, her head tilted. She didn't look offended. She looked interested. I am offering, the maestro said, choosing his words with immense care, to be your teacher. Not as a favor, not as charity, but because I believe I have a debt to pay to music itself to help you find your road. He held up a hand before Elena could speak. There would be conditions. For all of us. What conditions? Elena asked. For you, Alana, your job here remains, unchanged, if you wish it. But your hours would be your own, as Anya's studies would come first. You would be paid the same, regardless. This is not payment for lessons. They would be my contribution. And for Anya? Elena pressed dot. He turned his full attention to the girl. For you, it would be work. Harder work than you have ever done. I will not be a kind teacher. I will be demanding. I will make you play scales until you dream of them. I will make you study composers you hate. I will break down your instinct and rebuild it with knowledge. It will be frustrating. There will be days you will want to leave and never come back. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. But if you stay, if you work, you will not just play the music. You will command it. You will own it. And when you are ready, truly ready, the world will hear you. On your terms? The room was silent. Anya looked from the maestro's serious face to her mother's worried one. She looked at the piano. Can I still just play? She asked quietly. Sometimes? Not for scales. Just to play? The question, so childlike and so essential, broke the tension. The maestro's stern expression softened. Yes, he said. That is the most important part. You must always keep that. That is the thing we are trying to protect. He looked at Elena. The choice is yours. Both of yours. You must decide together. And if you say no, I will understand. Nothing changes. You have my word. Elena looked at her daughter. She saw not just a talented child, but the little girl who had hummed tunes before she could talk, who had saved her pocket money for a toy keyboard. She saw the years of quiet sacrifice, of secret practice. This was a door she could never open for her daughter alone. It was terrifying. But to close it out of fear. What do you want? Elena asked her, voice barely a whisper. Anya didn't hesitate. She looked at the maestro. I want to learn the map, she said. The real map, not just the shapes. And so it began. It was not a magical transformation. The very next day, the parlor was not a concert hall, but a classroom. The maestro started at the very beginning, as if she knew nothing. He taught her how to read music properly, note by note. He taught her the circle of fifths. He made her play C major scales with a metronome, so slowly it was agony. Sometimes he was sharp. No, the fingering is law. Do it again. His old impatience would flare. Anya would flinch, but she would not cry. She would set her jaw and do it again. And again. Elena would listen from the kitchen, her heart clenching at the harsh tone. But she also heard the changes. The scales began to sound like molten gold, even and perfect. The simple etudes began to sing under Anya's fingers in a way they never did for his other pupils. And sometimes, at the end of a lesson, the maestro would say, "Now, play something for yourself." And Anya would. Sometimes it was a snippet of a pop song she heard on the radio. Sometimes it was a sad, wandering melody of her own making. The maestro would sit in his chair, eyes closed, and just listen. Not as a teacher, but as a man hearing rain after a long drought. The promoter called, of course. The maestro handled him. She is a student. She is not a product. Do not call again for 2 years. He hung up the phone, feeling he had protected something precious. The apartment changed. Sheet music was no longer just on the piano stand. It was spread on the floor, on the sofa. Books were left open. The quiet was no longer just the maestro's silence. It was a shared, focused silence of study, punctuated by music sometimes halting, sometimes triumphant. Elena no longer just cleaned around the edges. She would sometimes bring in tea and sit in the corner, mending clothes while her daughter learned about batch or debated phrasing with the maestro. She was no longer invisible. She was part of it. One afternoon, about 6 months after it all began, the maestro set a new piece before Anya. It was a Mozart sonata, elegant and structured. "This is architecture," he said. "Every note is a brick." Anya played it through. It was good, technically correct, thoughtful, but it was careful. "Again," the maestro said. "And this time, remember the community center. Remember the sticky key. Remember the sunlight on the river outside the window. Play it not for me. Play it for that girl at the broken piano." Anya looked at him, understanding. She took a breath and began again. The same notes. But now they danced. They laughed. They sighed. The architecture was still there, but now it was filled with life. When she finished, the maestro didn't speak for a long moment. He just looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't criticism or shame, or even pride in his teaching. It was respect. "Good," he said, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000. "Now, the development section. Let us see what you can do with it." The lesson continued. In the kitchen, Elena smiled softly to herself, the rhythmic snip of her scissors keeping time with the music that now filled not just the apartment, but their joined lives. It was not an ending. It was a beginning, a complex, beautiful duet of discipline and spirit, just learning its first true measures.